Alright, so the three movies this week are the big one that came out today, as well as both the ones that came out last week. So now we'll be caught up for the most part, especially after the last video. So let's go ahead and start with The Lion King, which is a movie I was cautiously optimistic about, regardless of how much people are not big on the. Well, audiences obviously are throwing all their money at it, but a lot of people are also doing a lot of complaining about Disney doing all these live action remakes, which I have defended to one degree or another. It was harder to with Aladdin, but and as we go down the line, but I was cautiously optimistic about this one because I really loved what Jon Favreau did with the Jungle Book. And it's like, you're gonna do that just with The Lion King, and it's like, well, even if you're never gonna reach the peak that the original movie is, there's gotta be something worthwhile to that. And the whole idea of, like, making it seem as realistic as possible, almost like this is what it would look like if you went out into the wild and the story of The Lion King happened just in front of you. That's a really cool idea on an experimental front. As far as making a movie that's gonna hit you as emotionally and be as resonant as, say, the animated movie, maybe not so much. Going into this also, there were a lot of, like, the obvious criticism, because if it's coming out, it kind of caught people off guard that the critics aren't taking to it. And basically throwing out the criticisms like because of the way the animals are animated, they can't really emote the way they could in the animated movie, which is a problem because there's so much emotion in this story. Like, that's its whole thing. But then you've also got people comparing it to, like, Gus Van Sant's Psycho, about being like a shot-for-shot remake, despite the fact that this one's half an hour longer. But we'll get more into that. And I've been hearing this complaint repeated ever since one critic said it, where it was about the fact that Can You Feel the Love Tonight is performed during the day, despite the fact that the lyric is tonight. That kind of just, I mean, I guess I get it to an extent, but it also kind of reeks of somebody just desperately reaching for something to overreact to. It's a little ridiculous when there's plenty of other things here to talk about, and it's like I love the sort of lack of awareness of the irony of it all. How many people have been recycling and reusing those three critiques every time this movie comes up. It's like, but that's the way people are, especially in the internet age, unfortunately. But yes, there are definitely more than just three talking points to this movie, so let's go into those. Obviously, the first thing is going to be, you immediately, because this movie is the movie that it is, there's an immediate test from the very, very start. Because it's like, when you think about remakes like this, there are certain scenes you look out for. Like, we've done that with all the live action Disney remakes so far, where it's like, okay, well, as long as they pull this scene off, maybe they'll find it, maybe this scene, when we get to those moments. But with The Lion King, you immediately have to start with the Circle of Life, and that's going to immediately make or break you in regards to how you've done this. And there's some. Obviously, they do pretty much recreate it exactly, all the way from which animals are here and how they're reacting and the way they gather and all that. The beats of the song to the imagery. But there are moments where you can tell that it's probably going to be a bit underwhelming in comparison. The one that kind of really stood out to me was, I was pretty much fine with it until it got to Rafiki raising Simba, when it's this big, big triumphant moment in the original movie when he, like, hoists Simba in the air. We get like three cuts of that before we get the big shot and all the animals go crazy. And in this one, he just kind of plops down and says, "Here he is." It's like the birthing scene in Monty Python's The Meaning of Life when they say, "Hey, here's the baby." It's basically what it is. But still, when the song comes to that thunderous end and the title comes up, there's still, like, the little chill there. So it's there, but you can tell immediately that there is gonna be something missing. But you give it the benefit of the doubt and you let it keep going, because there'll be probably some scenes that work really well, and maybe some they kind of can't quite get on the mark. Because I did like this next scene, which we know is the scene with Scar and the mouse. They changed it up a little bit, and they also, in this moment, immediately show you how they're going to get the runtime to half an hour longer. And that is, instead of just the mouse, coming out and just standing here for a second, and then Scar bringing his paw down on it, there is also this moment leading up to it where we see the mouse, like, go all the way up and go through, like, the nature in this area where it's just its natural habitat, and then it ends up in the cave, and then Scar appears. And there is obviously something really... They show Scar's sinister qualities by him sort of toying with it in his hand in the original movie. And in this one, he's not doing that, but he's, like, stalking around it, which I think still kind of works in a way to use this mouse to show Scar's sinister qualities, even if it's not the same thing. I still think they kind of did that kind of nicely, and that still kind of gives him, like, this real predatory look. So there's that, and obviously this is going to pretty much be a lot of comparing to this one and the original. If you hadn't looked into that and you're curious about the context of me saying this, in December, I did a versus video with The Lion King and The Jungle Book, and in that video I basically I give my argument and my 2 cents of why the animated movie is one of the greatest movies ever made. So if you need that for context. But going on this scene also with Scar, this is the moment when you realize what this movie could have been and where its slight missteps are to where it's not quite that. Because you see in the animated movie, after Scar's about to eat this mouse, and Mufasa just appears and says, drop him, Scar, and stuff like that. In this movie, they give Mufasa a grand entrance to stop this mouse from being eaten, where he appears and the score gets really big, and it's like, that's really cool. They're giving Mufasa, like, that really just, grand appearance and feel with using the score to, like, just make him burst into this scene. But then it shoots itself in the foot because the score is still going and booming triumphantly when the dialogue starts. So it's like them trying to talk over this score that didn't settle down before they started talking. And then it's like, oh, and there's a lot of things throughout the movie like that. I was talking about the timing with, the music, the circle of life, and the imagery. A lot of that is really... And I don't necessarily know if it's something I would notice if it wasn't for the original movie, but it feels like there are many moments where it's like it's off a little bit, like that, where the timing of the imagery and the music doesn't quite add up, and like things, either the music's too late, the imagery's too early, and it just looks like the scene at the end is kind of what really caught me off guard with that. When Simba finally, takes to the top of Pride Rock like he was always meant to, and he does his roar, and the music is building and building and building to that. But it's like he roars too early, because the whole thing is how that beat in the song goes right into him roaring, and that's the beauty of that moment, that's the magic of it. But he roars before we get to that point in the song, in the music. It's just, and then it just makes everything feel off balance. Like I said, maybe that's something I wouldn't notice if it wasn't for the original movie, but it's still... But that's the whole thing, is you're trying to basically recapture that magic, and that's just even little things like that matter, unfortunately, for this movie. So, but as far as other things Scar-related while we're on him, I did like that they kept the detail where instead of his claws kind of coming in and out like a normal lion, his are always out. I like that they kept that, even in regards to the whole, realism thing they were going for. And some of the dialogue between him and Mufasa in this scene, where it was, when it's the same dialogue, more or less. They keep pretty much the same dialogue, and then they just add other lines to try and enrich it a little bit. Sometimes the new lines are really good, but most of the time they're just kind of stretching the scenes out for some reason. So there's the moment when I don't know if there's some sort of backstory to this, like deep in the story or whatever, but the mystery behind where exactly Scar's scar comes from. And I had just kind of always assumed it was like a fight with Mufasa in their youth or something. And it's interesting to me that this movie seems to more or less commit to that. I'm assuming that's what they're alluding to. When they add one word to an already existing line. When Mufasa says, "Is that a challenge?" and Scar says, "I wouldn't dream of challenging you." And this one, after he says that, he adds, "again," dramatically. So it's like, I guess we're going on that Mufasa gave him the scar, but that's... And I mean, it adds... They do certain things, they add certain things to this movie to kind of set off the rivalry between them two. He gets a whole dialogue about how the reason Mufasa's king is because Sarabi chose him over him, which is something we never really went into before that I find kind of interesting. And then there's the moment that I did like, where they had, obviously, the animation and Jeremy Irons' voice work really worked wonders in regards to letting us know how evil Scar is before he goes full on evil. Like, giving us all the telltale signs that this guy is fucking crazy. So, I liked the moment when he accidentally informs him of the elephant graveyard so that Simba will run out there like an idiot. And when he says, "Remember, it's our little secret." And then in the original movie, Scar just kind of laughs to himself a little bit. But this movie is all about playing Scar deathly serious. He doesn't have any of that sort of playfulness in his evil that Scar had. Like the oops thing when he accidentally reveals the elephant graveyard, it's nothing like that. It's all kind of straight. But what I did like was after he says it's our secret and Simba leaves, just the very, like, bitter, resentful way he says, "Your Majesty," after he's gone. Like, the stuff like that, I feel like it works, and it adds sort of... It shows the character traits off more, with stuff that the animation might be lacking in, which is nice. And as far as the score itself, obviously it's a lot of Zimmer redoing what he did. A lot of it feels like they really didn't change anything at all, and some of it does feel a bit... I guess almost like a bit harder in some instances, but in others maybe it's not hard enough. But the thing that I mainly liked about it was some of the meshing, like where it's the score. Obviously, I think most of us know the score to The Lion King inside out by this point, so we can tell which ones are from which scenes originally. But they mix it up a little bit, and while those pieces of score are in their original scenes, they also show up in other scenes. And there's, like, sometimes it feels a bit, when they use the score from the original movie where Simba and Scar are fighting at the very end, is throughout the movie in various places. I thought that was an interesting, if questionable, piece to decide to use throughout the movie. Like when Mufasa shows up and attacks the hyenas, it's used there. But then there's one instance where they did that, which I thought was amazing and brilliant. And it sort of kind of brought history back to itself and kind of showed that we were coming back around. The moment when Simba finally realizes, after Scar confesses that he's the one that killed Mufasa, and Simba realizes his whole life's been a lie, and now I've got to fight Scar. And when that starts, when it initially starts when they're fighting, it's playing the score from the Stampede, which is such a beautiful way to bring it full circle. I really love that. Yeah, like I said, though, as far as it being, like, sometimes the timing feels a bit off, and like I said, sometimes things might be too early or too late or something, and it does kind of throw you off. But, speaking of the hyenas, which I just mentioned, they do something interesting here where the way this movie handles its comedy relief, because obviously Timon and Pumbaa are their own, thing, but the hyenas kind of were also, in between the three of them and, like, the rapport, I guess you could call it, that they had. To where I was saying in that other video when I talked about the original movie was that they have this way of being threatening, but they're also... It's almost like they don't take themselves seriously, or what they're doing, and they don't take Scar seriously until things really get real. But just the interesting thing about this is, number one, they apparently don't work for Scar right away in this. Scar just kind of comes across them after that's happened. Like, because the thing that's going on here is that Shenzi is basically a second main villain in this movie. And she kind of has the balance between the other two hyenas, who are Eric Andre and Keegan-Michael Key, and based on that casting alone, you can tell they're going to be the comedy relief, but Shenzi is made to be genuinely threatening and, like, genuinely villainous, and has nothing to do with the comedy relief. And I found that interesting that they find that balance by using it in their character. Instead of making all three hyenas either threatening in one moment or comedy relief in the next, they split it up to where Shenzi is constantly threatening, and the other two are constantly comedy relief. And that's even enough, I think. That's an interesting... Because I do kind of just like the idea in general of Shenzi being more evil. Particularly in the moment when I was getting ready to say this was after Mufasa fights them off, and then they leave. Usually, we're expecting that shot of Scar overseeing this because he's the author of all these horrible things that happen. But because they don't work for him, apparently, and that's not how this movie's playing it up, that shot we're expecting of Scar looming is a shot of Shenzi before it dissolves into the next scene. Which I thought was interesting, but it also kind of feels a bit half-assed and sudden when it is, like, Scar just shows up. I mean, there is something to an extent, because it's like, you know, oh, he's a lion that wants to kill the king. Okay, we should probably get behind him and not even ask questions. But still, it does all feel very abrupt, because this movie kind of goes back and forth. It's either really sort of dragging things out that we know the beats of, or it's feeling rushed. And the animated movie kind of fleshed those things out a little more. It keeps going back and forth between that, which is kind of jarring. So, as far as the songs go, now it is to my understanding, some of these are probably going to feel half-assed as well, and what appears to be the reason, if I'm remembering correctly, it's been a while, is, I think it was they were just going to do a few of the songs, like a small handful of the songs, sort of like they did in The Jungle Book, where it's just like 2 or 3 of the recognizable songs and that's it. And then there was an outcry, and they're like, okay, we'll do more of the songs, but Be Prepared won't be in it. And when you said Be Prepared won't be in it, people lost their fucking minds. Rightfully. I mean, of course, if you're going to do the songs, that would be... Even back when you were like, hey, maybe we'll just do a few of them, that should have been one of them. So you can kind of tell that Be Prepared is a bit... Seems a bit last minute in this movie. Where it's more like a... obviously no Nazi imagery or anything this time around, but the hyena's kind of chanting it, and Chiwetel kind of comes in on, like, the last verse of it. And it's... I can see that being underwhelming for people, even though I do think... I love the moment when Chiwetel screams King within the song. It's like the one moment where it's like, yeah, why can't that be the whole song? But it's like one word. Kind of gives us the same vibe that we had Jeremy Irons and Jim Cummings doing in the original movie. But and then we have stuff like I was petrified. I was absolutely terrified we were going to get Morning Report. I felt like it was brewing a little bit, and then it didn't happen. So thank God. But still, we do have the big numbers like I Just Can't Wait to Be King, which is one of those cases where the song is great. The song has always been great, obviously. But you really get a sense of how important it is to have it with the extremely colorful imagery that comes with it in the original movie. So when you have that constantly in your mind, yeah, this is going to seem really underwhelming that it's just kind of them trotting around while he sings it. There's no, like, you know, backgrounds changing into these really, you know, this really spectacular artwork and all that, and all the different kinds of animation, like the waterfall that Zazu goes over and stuff like that. None of that's here, it's just them sort of walking around and singing it. And it does kind of have a big finish. Like, if I wasn't aware of the original movie at all, this scene when he's, you know, singing the last part of the song, and all the animals are, like, gathering behind him, and they're getting, like, it's getting more massive and massive, the groups of animals behind him. That's a really nice finish. Like I said, if you don't know the grand, amazing scale of the way the original did it. So it's just always that looming over it, and making it very underwhelming. in the process. So, and then you get, I did like some changes they made to Hakuna Matata, mainly because in the original movie, the whole idea was that it seemed like Timon and Pumbaa were just out in the middle of nowhere alone, except for the bugs, more or less. But this whole idea that they live in like a whole area with other animals there. But the thing that I do kind of like is when they're coming in and he has his same dialogue of any antelope or hippo, and you see these animals hearing this and like they're nervous around him, which is funny in context. But this is about the time that they. This is the only time in the movie after this that they add a couple of scenes, which is weird because they're back to back scenes. It's like they got to the middle of the movie and they're like, wait, this is going too fast. Let's add 2 scenes. There's one very prolonged segment in the middle. It was that segment I was talking about where Scar is saying, Sarabi chose Mufasa over him. And then this transitions into a continuous scene of we actually see Nala leave Pride Rock to go get Simba. And I actually do like this scene because, once again, it adds to the threat that Scar is. Because it's her basically trying to get around him and the hyenas and how she feels trapped and she's got to sneak by them. And he's just like looming everywhere and then he's like starting to hunt because he senses something is off. And I like that they sort of added more to the Scar threat with that scene. And then that's immediately followed by a new scene where Simba is trying to frolic with an antelope, and Timon and Pumbaa have to explain to him why the antelope doesn't want to be friends with him. Which sounds more profound than it actually is, but Simba just kind of brushes it off, and it's clearly just a filler scene that could have had something interesting to say, but just had to get on its merry way. So then we eventually get to the point where Nala returns, and as we were saying, Can You Feel the Love Tonight does happen very abruptly. And like I said, it's really interesting to see what exactly they want to rush and what they want to make longer. Because it feels like the stuff that they're rushing may be more important than the stuff they dragged out, where they kind of wanted us to take in, the whole environment, which is nice. Which is the whole thing about just sort of lingering on the surroundings and kind of showing us the jungle and letting it feel lived in and all that. But yeah, when it gets to some things, they probably could have continued to slow it down a little bit. But they don't, especially with Nala figuring out that he's leaving. Because originally she has the whole scene with Timon and Pumbaa and Rafiki there, and there's the whole confusion, which is really great. And in this one, he's just doing his run back, and she's like, whoa, there you are, where are we going? And he's like, we're going home, come on. So they go there together. So stuff like that kind of feels like it's sort of half-assed, almost like they almost forgot what they were doing or something, so... Yeah, but there's still stuff in here that they added that's nice as long as it stays small, like Simba chasing around the beetle before Scar talks to him about the elephant graveyard. It's sort of a nice way to show, like, Simba's youthfulness and the fact that he's really not, like, he's not to the stage of predator that he's supposed to grow into by any means. And Scar even making that comment saying, I hope we're not attacked by a beetle. So, stuff like that I do think works. And the way, there is also a moment that I really love that adds to the tragedy of the whole thing. It's in the Stampede when Mufasa's on the side of the cliff and he's trying to climb up and we know that Scar is going to be up there. And we kind of go on that a little longer, of like how desperate his climb is to get to the top. Which makes it even more brutal when he finally gets all the way up there and Scar does what he does. Made it all the more brutal because not only does Scar grab his paws and throw him off, he, like, swipes him in the face before he does it, too. Like, just as an extra fuck you. So, yeah, there are moments like that where you can see where there was maybe, you could tell there was a reason for doing this to sort of add up. Because the Jungle Book took a lot of, like, liberties and did their own thing. Even though by the end, the climax did pretty much feel like the Lion King's climax. But still, in the way that they sort of... Like I was saying, the way they took the animation in Scar's character, not literally, but the more animated stuff that he does, and the way they sort of also took that out of when Idris Elba did Shere Khan, where it's like, it's really good as far as voice work, but it's also... Some of the voice, it's almost like it's a little weak. Like, even James Earl Jones himself coming back from Mufasa, you can sense that... And I heard Favreau talking about how, like, in the recording booth, you could still hear, like, the gravity in his voice and all that. But there's still moments where, like the scene when he has to teach Simba a lesson after he attacks the hyenas and saves them. And it's like when Simba sees, his own paw and the giant paw print of Mufasa, that whole thing, and then he hears Mufasa call to him and say his name. And in that moment in the original movie, it is so booming and so intimidating. But when he says it here, it's more like, get over here, we're going to talk. And there's nothing really that intimidating about it. And then this shot just kind of lingers on their silhouettes against the sky. But like they're like not moving at all while they're doing this dialogue where he's like, you deliberately disobeyed me and stuff like that. You don't hear like the internal sort of parental panic inside him, where it's less like he was worried about, what does this mean for the kingdom, and more like, do you realize what could have happened to you? It just kind of sticks with the whole, hey, you almost fucked up the kingdom thing, and it just feels very like sort of stilted. So yeah, and that's basically what a lot of it sort of feels like, where it's like the scenes are present on the screen, but there's just even in some of the voice work, not just the animation in their faces, just it feels like the emotion just isn't quite there, and it's so yeah. But I do. There's still some stuff that I do like. A lot of the Timon and Pumbaa stuff, surprisingly, is well handled. Like this is the kind of thing I was talking about, where the balancing act, where it's like Timon and Pumbaa are like, they eat bugs and they, have all the fart jokes and stuff like that. They're the comedy relief, but they're also so incredibly invaluable to this story, because if they hadn't found Simba and raised him, given what happened to him, he could have become a supervillain without them, without their way of life, and without Hook and Matata and all that stuff. And then Billy Eichner and Seth Rogen are pretty much perfect. Obviously, Seth Rogen warned us in interviews about his singing, which was inevitable. But still, and especially in Billy Eichner's case, you would think Nathan Lane is absolutely, totally irreplaceable. And obviously, to an extent, certainly he is. But I do really like what Eichner's doing here also, and it kind of makes him even more snarky than he was before, but still manages to be funny about it too. And his singing voice is really great too. But I did also find it interesting the way they did, and I guess this almost ties into like when they did like the Lion King 1.5, where the Timon and Pumbaa in this movie are like really meta. Which is kind of seems like it's out of place when everything else is trying to be serious, but at the same time, that's kind of just the vibe Timon and Pumbaa have, period, anyway. Because you have the moment when they do Hook and Matata as we know it, where they start off and Simba's a cub, and then they walk across the giant log and he becomes grown. And as the song is ending and they're walking away, you hear Timon or Pumbaa say, we've been singing this for a long time, you've grown 400 pounds since we started. Stuff like that. There's the whole thing where in the original version of Hakuna Matata, Pumbaa starts to say, every time that I farted, and then Timon cuts him off before he can say that. But of course in this, Rogan gets all the way through the word and then says, why didn't you stop me? And then, I don't know that I'd want to give it away, but the luau saying, the dress and dragon do the hula, is not that. But they but they came up with an idea that's just as yeah, you just have to see. But so that's, I guess, more or less what we have here. Obviously the animation is, completely out of this world. We talked about that with the Jungle Book endlessly, and that's still the case here too. Even if they didn't quite work on the seeing if their faces could emote at all, which is something like, you imagine, like, one that really stands out in the Jungle Book is Baloo's face was like so expressive, and how none of them are really like that here. Sometimes in Zazu's case, their faces aren't even big enough to have any room to do anything like that. But there's still like, and even just some of the details. Favreau was talking about how they animated like every single individual blade of grass. There's when Mufasa's explaining everything to Simba at the top of Pride Rock, and his mane is blowing in the wind and stuff like that, and it's like just feels so detailed. There's the moment where this is also kind of a runtime thing, getting it to 2 hours instead of an hour and a half. The way Rafiki finds out that Simba is still alive, when he like falls on the dust and it makes its way there, and he just senses it. Here they do something where it's like the tuft of his hair that makes it all the way back to Rafiki, and it's like it's really reminiscent of the scene in the Polar Express when he loses the ticket, and it like makes a whole sort of one long shot journey, and then ends up back on the train. They basically do something kind of like that, which is one of my favorite scenes in the Polar Express. So this is a scene that I don't hate for any reason. So yeah, so basically what you've been hearing, just it is worth talking about a little more than just making three or so points and saying, oh, this movie's pointless, it's a cash grab, Disney is soulless, they are the devil itself, whatever the people say. But yeah, there is something really underwhelming here, and I was really wanting to go into this sort of hoping to kind of feel that magic again. We know going in, we're not deluded. We know going into this, they're just not going to recapture the magic of the original, because that's impossible. Because not even their movies in general, just in any capacity, can hardly reach the emotional peaks that the original movie does. Let alone trying to just redo the movie. And it's every now and then they do get those moments, and you still kind of feel it. But they're so few and far between, and it just still feels like there's this sort of... There's actually kind of a dullness to it. And it does feel really long, when this movie should be a breeze because of how well we know the story points front to back. But you get a sense of that. And I think it's also the whole thing of sometimes they rush things, sometimes they drag things out. You never not quite know which route they're going to take with each new scene. So it does feel like really sort of long. When watching the original movie now, it feels like 15 minutes. But yeah, but like I said, as far as like an experiment goes, I could see it, working as something like that. And it's interesting. It's interesting that it exists, because I could see this being a talking point that people would have. Like this movie as it is, people having a what if, like what if this movie existed, what would it look like? So we do have that now, which is, I guess, the most it can give us. So obviously that's a letdown, but that's where we are now. So it's just a matter now of what is like I know they're gonna do Lady and the Tramp, and they're working on they're in like the pre-stages of like the Sword and the Stone, and those two are going straight to the Disney Plus thing that comes out in November. So that's so we'll see how far those go down. But yeah, and then the next one is, I don't even remember. Mulan's in there somewhere. There's a big one I think I'm forgetting, but I'll remember it eventually. I think they're still doing the Cruella thing with Emma Stone, the Maleficent sequel. None of these sound that promising, except maybe I hear they're like going a totally different route with the Mulan thing. So we'll see where that goes. But everything else, it's hard to say. The Little Mermaid obviously is making news for all the wrong reasons, whichever side you stand on with that. But yeah. So let's just go on to the other two real quick, because I don't really have much to say about them in comparison. Let's start with Crawl. Crawl is a movie that I was just kind of like, oh, it's a murderous alligator movie. It's like, maybe it's like a callback to like campy monster movies. It's got Sam Raimi's name plastered on it as like a producer. It's the director of The Hills Have Eyes and High Tension, the Piranha movie from 2010, Horns with Daniel Radcliffe. A dude that has a very interesting vision and really, really, really loves his gore. So I always kind of go into his movies with an interest in regards to exactly how kind of over the top can we go. So, and the good reviews. I was really not expecting this movie to get the reviews that it has. But with that said, these same reviews were doing a lot of positive comparisons to The Shallows with Blake Lively, which is a movie a lot of people love a lot, and I didn't like really at all. And many, many people let me know how pissed off they were that I felt that way the 4 years or so ago that it came out. Or 3 years, or whenever the hell it was. So, when it starts off, obviously all of this is brought on by this giant hurricane. And we do have some really cool shots here at the beginning where she's giving us her blatant backstory with her whole, diving and swimming thing going on. But we see out this giant window this storm that is just looming over. It looks like the end of the fucking world is just coming right our way. Um, and then, once that's established, like I said, we do have blatant foreshadowing. We've got her whole thing. She's got a thing on her dashboard that's a shark eating a person. All this stuff, and we know the direction this movie is going. But before we get there, we have to go. We have to literally push our way through some mud. Because this movie pretty much has one setting, which is Barry Pepper's basement, where they're trapped with these alligators that are going to eat them. And so, to get there, we have endless scenes of her screaming "Dad" while looking for him. And it obviously kind of shows a bit of a desperation the more it goes, but at the same time, it also gets incredibly grating after about the 40th time and like the 5th location, until she finally finds him. It's like Barry Pepper is one of the great underrated actors out there, and it's like I have never been more relieved to see him show up, because it would stop her from fucking screaming "Dad" every 5 seconds. But anyway, once she gets there, she finds him, and he's stuck. And just as they're trying to figure this out, the water comes in, and the alligators with it, and then this monster movie starts to take place. And there are some decent ideas here, I suppose, like the idea of adding the looters in and stuff like that, and these different ways where they could potentially have help, but then they also find themselves in like these situations where they're trapped and they have to find their way out of them, which could be exciting, but at the same time, after a while, this kind of start to get redundant. It kind of seems like he's starting to use the same techniques to get the thrills out of it. And stuff like introducing characters like the looters and stuff like that is really just increasing the body count to show us people getting eaten by alligators. But at the same time, you kind of want to defend the movie on that regard by saying, is that not what we're here for? Is that we're not? Are we not here to watch the guy that directed the 2010 Piranha movie use alligators to kill people with? And so there is, like, if that's the kind of thing you're here for, there is something to that in the way that it's sort of, that on top of the hurricane, the way it sort of blends the monster movie and the disaster movie. Like, there is a sort of classic feel they seem to be going for. I don't think they quite get there, but you can see, like, the beginnings of it, which I guess you can appreciate to an extent. And then, like I said, there are the thrills that come, but one of the things that kind of holds this back is how many times our main character is close to death. And when I say close to death, I mean, like one of the great thrilling scenes of the movie is we build her up, and she's, we get her backstory, we know where she's coming from, we know what her goals are in regards to her dad and stuff like that, the distance between them, but also getting out of this together. And this isn't a spoiler by any means, which is the point I'm getting to, is, like, the reason I'm bringing it up is because it's not a spoiler, is half an hour into the movie, this character that is so clearly our main character gets grabbed by the leg by an alligator and dragged around viciously. Which is the kind of thing you would see, like, it would be like the death scene of a side character in any other moment. And that's the kind of stuff where it's like, it really shows the danger they're in, that kind of thing can happen to the main character merely a half an hour in. But the thing is this happens quite a bit, and there's really no lasting damage. She takes so many hits that should injure her throughout this movie and beyond. But it just kind of has no particular impact. She's apparently fine. What happens to her happens to another character, and their limbs are just coming off like nothing. But here it's like, oh, so it's this kind of hero, so maybe the thrills aren't as thrilling, and maybe the danger isn't as major as it seems, because she's going to have a lot of, I guess you could call it plot armor on her side. She has the power of the script to keep her alive and all of her limbs intact, so good for her. And then they kind of take the cheap route by adding a dog into the equation, and so there's always the constant question of, oh my god, is the dog safe or is he not? Which is just a cheap trick in any particular movie like this. A classic thing in this movie, in this type of movie. The Meg was doing that shit, to use a recent example. So the thing about this movie, though, that I feel like is probably what makes it work for a lot of people and kind of adds to the tensity of it, is the claustrophobic setting. How we pretty much just have, a lot of the movie is set in Barry Pepper's basement and them feeling trapped in there. We get some really good shots of like the gators like circling around and stuff like that. But even so, um, I honestly feel like this is the kind of movie, especially setting up the whole hurricane thing and the floods and all that. This is a movie that really needed to expand its setting. Like it works as a claustrophobic movie to an extent, but when you've got such a whole grand scale thing going on the outside of stuff, I really wanted to see more stuff out there, and I feel like you could have gotten a lot more of a thrilling movie out of it. Um, but nevertheless, they go more for the claustrophobic vibe, and I think they kind of suffer for it, even though I totally get the idea behind how that could work as like a full movie. But yeah, and in the meantime, it's one of those movies where we get the run of the mill backstories, and her and her dad talk about their issues and what all went wrong, and all the stuff about her mom and all that. And it's one of those movies where you're like, in one side you're like, oh, this is where we get the character development. This is what happens in, critically acclaimed monster movies, where it's like, oh, I'm surprised by how much focus there is on the emotions of the characters and shit like that. But now is not the time. It's just not the time for that shit. In this scenario, there's never a good time for that. And it feels like the movie just halts to say, hey, will you care about our characters that we're not even remotely going to try to kill? So what are you worried about? What do you, like, what's keeping you in suspense here? Like, what's it worth? Like, what's the payoff to getting to know these characters? Um, just that. Just that they'll probably be fine, because this movie is terrified of ripping their limbs off. The main character, anyway. So, yeah, so I kind of had trouble getting into it, but I could see where this could be a worthwhile movie, especially with the meshing of the genres and trying to give it a bit of a classic feel, but overall it just kind of didn't really work for me. Sort of in the same vein that The Shallows didn't really work for me either, so it's fine, I guess, but that's pretty much all it is for me. So let's end on Stuber, the new comedy with Kumail Nanjiani and Dave Bautista. A teaming that almost feels inevitable because of how much both of them have been showing up lately and how they kind of come from different sides. But both of them have shown how great they are with comedy, with it being, Nanjiani's area of expertise and Bautista showing that he's able to be as funny as he is believable in like action roles and stuff like that. So bring these two things together, and here's your combination. It was like, it was writing on the wall a long time ago, and here it is. And it was being built up to me, and I heard this in a lot of places also, basically being a comedic version of Collateral. Which I mean, I guess in vague concept, sure, but not really. Like, not really at all. But I mean, like I said, don't think I. I mean, I totally get why people would say that, but I feel like there's so many other movies you could compare this to that don't set it up for the fall by building it up to be one of Michael Mann's best movies. So you have what I saw here was more something like Central Intelligence, you know. So and it kind of has that vibe and that tone. Where it's mostly comedic, but sometimes the violence can be pretty over the top, and it's sort of doing a satire on the action genre and all that, I suppose. But the thing about it is, what are the jokes going to be? Because the joke that the whole movie is, like, the whole storyline is, that punchline is what it is, so what do we have besides that? Well, so it's not exactly a one-joke movie, but it does have a lot of jokes it really, really wants to stick with. I feel like there are a number of ways you could have set up this story, but the way the movie decides to set it up is to have Batista going through, like, LASIK surgery, so he's basically temporarily blind, and that's why he needs an Uber driver to get him around and chase. The guy that played Rama in the Raid movies is, I guess, our villain, even though he's only in the beginning and the end, but whatever. That's pretty much how you describe most of the people in this movie. They're in the beginning, then they're in the end. And just the two of them sort of in between, dicking around. So that's a joke pretty much through the entire movie, is that Batista is temporarily blind. I kind of wish they'd taken more of the temporary approach, where it's like, do it for so long, and then once Nanjiani's stuck in it, then just let it keep going. He doesn't have to necessarily stay blind the whole movie because you have to stick to that joke. And you got to admire their commitment. They could have. You could say it's the easy way out. To eventually have him get his eyesight back like halfway through and then just let it be normal. They do commit to the joke, but that's the problem, is like how funny can this joke be for so long? And how much can they really do with it apart from having him run into shit and misconstrue what shit is? And that's all it is. They don't need to take that joke any further. So that's what a lot of the movie's jokes are. But also going on, we do have a lot of side stories here, most of them extremely cliche. We have Kumail Nanjiani's story is that he has a crush on a girl who just broke up with her douchebag boyfriend. So it's like, oh, he's always been in love with her. And the take they try to put on this is to kind of put like the, I guess, unconventional joke on this cliche setup for their love story, is that she's drunk and basically calling him up to be like a booty call. And he's trying to get to her in time, but she keeps calling him back and flip-flopping. So it's like, and I guess there's supposed to be something funny in there. Like, you can, like, it's one of those things, this is one of those movies where you can identify the comedy when you're not laughing. Where it's like, oh yes, this is the comedic setup for this. And it's like, oh yes, that would be the natural comedic payoff to that setup they did earlier. But you're not laughing. Or at least I wasn't. Actually, I heard that audiences seem to be taking to this pretty well, but I was not one of those people. Much as I really like, the people here, and obviously the story points are really easily choreographed. There is one person in particular that walks on screen, and as soon as they walk on screen, you know they're the twist villain. They tease Karen Gillan. For some reason, I don't know if it's just so people can say, hey, it's Nebula and Drax, but she's killed in the opening scene, which is why he's alone and bitter and seeking revenge on the villains because she was killed. And it's like, oh, will she come back? Will it be like, to talk about Central Intelligence, will she be like Aaron Paul in Central Intelligence or something? No, she just never comes back. They just wanted to, I guess, market it with Karen Gillan's name, put her on the poster, put her name up there and everything, but no, after the first 5 minutes, nothing. So, I guess to their credit, it would have been obviously predictable to take the Aaron Paul route, and it's like, oh, she was the villain the whole time, she faked her death and all that, which is honestly what I was expecting, but then the second I saw the other person, it was like, oh, I see what they're doing. Now I know who the twist villain is going to be. The fact that you even know there is going to be a twist villain in a movie like this just says everything about how fucking dry and stale this whole thing has gotten. This whole concept in general of, like, the buddy cop thing is something that's still going on today that I just don't understand. Because it had its era, for sure. For all the way from the early 80s to the late 90s, it had a nice little prime going. But then, like, every time you see now two people that seem like opposites having good chemistry, you immediately hear people saying, like, oh, that's a buddy cop movie in the making, and it's like, really? But would that be good, though? Because this is a concept that is just getting really, really fucking old. And there's just really nothing more... This movie shows there's really nothing more you can do with it anymore. It just solely depends on who you cast, and then you have to go on that. And that's never a good way to do things. You've got to have a little bit of a foundation regardless of the talent that your two guys have. Otherwise, you're going to get movies like this, where they're just fucking lost the whole time. So we get old bits like... a guy getting accidentally shot, like we saw in Due Date, or like we saw in Game Night, or like we saw in a billion other fucking movies. We have multiple puke jokes. I thought we'd moved on from that, but I guess not. So we're still in the 80s, I guess. But still, there is something that Kumail Nanjiani has in particular. And Batista has it here too, in a few scenes here and there. But Nanjiani has, like, a way of delivering his lines that sometimes can just be so perfect. There's one particular line when he says, they're talking about something, I can't remember the context now, but he says, okay, yeah, we'll do that. You do your thing, and I'll go fuck myself. And the way he says that, though, is, like, that's a funny line, but he's so sincere when he says it, and that's what makes it hilarious. But, like, that's the only line I really remember that was funny. Everything else is just like a situational thing, or oh, everything's frantic, and it's like, oh, a guy like him in this environment? Oh, no, what's he gonna do? This is hits that shit, and it's really tired, and there's really nothing here. And then it obviously keeps going back and forth between being that and being this really violent action movie, which we've seen going back and forth in stuff like The Hitman's Bodyguard, where it's like, are you trying to do like a satire on action movies and how over the top they are, or are you trying to be an over the top action movie? You seem to want to have your cake and eat it too with those, and neither one is working. It's like, if you were just one or if you were just the other, I still don't think this would work, any of it. Because it's all just so damn stale. So that's, I don't know. And these action scenes also, they just kind of keep going on and on and on and on forever. Like, this movie's really short. It's like an hour 30 something. And it feels like so many large fractions of it are just these basic ass action scenes of people shooting at shit and all that. It's like, I feel like the heat is in there too. This whole thing, there's nothing new you can do with this. Why are people always suggesting the goddamn buddy cop movie still? I don't get it. So, and like I said, overall to me, it just isn't funny. Like, I was trying to really find the moments that were like laugh out loud, and I just could not get there at all. There was not even like a hint of it. Like, not even just a little bit of maybe possibly I'll get there. It just became hopeless after a while. But, like I said, I'm sure this will be popular with people who are, like, easily pleased. And I don't mean that in a condescending way. Like, if you're the kind of person who just, just sits down for a comedy and it doesn't matter what the fuck, maybe you'll get something out of this. Maybe it'll be entertaining enough. But there's really no reason for it to exist. Even the people that like it, there's no way they remember it by next month, if that. So, yeah. So, yeah, I kind of hate to be a downer this week on movies that people like, but that's what we've come to, unfortunately. So, but next week we have the new Tarantino, and that's all I give a shit about. So, we will explore that. We're going to talk about True Romance and Natural Born Killers. All that stuff. Big Little Lies ends on Sunday, so we'll have that. I'm going to do work on a Versus right after this that I'm kind of excited to do. So, yeah, so there's plenty of stuff. We can get past this. Just push this to the side, and we'll move on. So, until all that stuff, that's it.